Hello and welcome to another episode of All Politics is Local. I'm your host, John Tian. All Politics is Local is a production of the Greater Blackstone Valley Democrats. For more information about the Greater Blackstone Valley Dems, feel free to visit our website at www.gbvdems.org. With me in the studio tonight is Jim Henderson, the treasurer of Voter Choice Massachusetts. Jim, thank you so much for being here tonight.
Glad to be here. Glad to have another good, strong bass voice to speak with tonight.
We'll have a bass competition here.
Absolutely.
Okay. So we have a half hour to discuss voter choice. Let's just jump right in. What is Voter Choice Massachusetts? What kind of a problem are you guys trying to solve?
Well, Voter Choice Massachusetts is a nonpartisan 501c3 organization that's devoted to educating the people of the Commonwealth about important ways to better enhance our election system, most particularly through the idea of ranked choice voting, which is a voting method that has been adopted in a number of municipalities around the country over a number of years. It was actually recently enacted statewide in the state of Maine.
Okay.
So we're hoping to bring that important electoral reform here to Massachusetts.
Okay, and this is something that we currently have the technology to be able to do? Was it something that prior to today, the technology really wasn't there for it? Or?
Well, the technology is certainly better enhanced today to be able to do that, but ranked choice voting has been around for an awful long time. In fact, there have been people elected to the Australian Parliament for over 100 years.
Oh, really?
Using ranked choice voting. So this is not a unique or new idea. This is something that's been used in a number of venues around the world, and in fact here in the United States for a number of years. The only difference is that it's really been done in the United States at the municipal level. Again, we're hoping to bring it statewide here in Massachusetts.
Okay. With me in the director's chair tonight is we have a guest director, Sarah McLaughlin. Normally we have Brett Bellinger in there, but Brett needed some time off. So Sarah, if you don't mind, would you bring up slide number 2 for us? Jim,
Right.
Jim brought some graphics.
So one of the problems that ranked choice voting is designed to deal with is the idea of spoiler candidates. So right here on the screen here, we're looking at the election in Maine, the gubernatorial election back in 2010, where Paul LePage was elected with a very, almost small plurality of the vote.
Yeah, very slim plurality with
Right.
just a little over 1%.
Right. So
Yeah.
there were 3 candidates. We had Paul LePage was the Republican. We had Elliott Cutler, who was an independent candidate. And then we had also Libby Mitchell, who was the Democratic candidate. Now, as you can see up here, LePage and Cutler were very close, and Libby Mitchell was further behind. But because we have a first-past-the-post system that only requires a plurality of the vote, a candidate with less than 40% of the vote there in Maine was actually elected governor, and now twice up there in the state of Maine.
And I know quite a few people in the state of Maine who are a little bit disappointed in Paul LePage's performance as governor.
Exactly. And so one of the problems here, we look at this, is that we know for a fact that a majority of the voters in Maine did not support Paul LePage, at least by the vote here, that we had 60% of the voters in that election wanted to elect somebody else.
Okay.
And that's a really important problem if we want to make sure that our elected officials are in fact representing our interests.
Okay.
And the only way we can get that to happen is by picking, call it the right person, at election day.
So let's, we also had another example of this that's kind of close to home. Sarah, would you bring up slide number 3, please?
Right. So in this slide here, we look back at the gubernatorial primary here in Massachusetts back in 2014, where you had 3 candidates, the leading candidates. You had Martha Coakley, Steve Grossman, and Don Berwick. Now, again, as we all know, Martha Coakley won that primary with a plurality vote, here about 42%. But it was pretty reasonably understood that Steve Grossman and Donald Berwick were much more closely aligned in their policies than they were with Martha Coakley. And so if you actually bring up the next slide, you will see that together, Steve Grossman and Don Berwick represented a fairly clear majority of the support at the time of the primary.
Okay.
And
yep,
so
57% to 42%.
Right,
yep.
Exactly. And so it really looks like Steve Grossman and Donald Berwick split the vote amongst Democratic primary voters back in 2014, which led to Martha Coakley winning the primary. And as we well know, Martha Coakley did not win the general election. And so ultimately the question is here, did the Democrats actually elect the strongest candidate to run that election? And so the Democrats actually have a very interesting problem coming up in the 3rd congressional district. As we found out last week, Nikki Tsongas is not going to be running for re-election up there.
Right.
And probably, it looks like everybody and their uncle is going to run for that open seat when it comes open next year.
And is this, I think we have a slide about this one too. Is this slide
exactly.
number 5?
So, yeah, exactly.
Sarah,
And
if we could have slide number 5, please. Yep, there.
When this seat was last open in 2007, there were a number of candidates who won. Nikki Tsongas won that election, again with just a plurality. You had Eileen Donahue was in 2nd place, you had Jamie Eldridge there, but no candidate got the majority of support. Now, ultimately, the person who won the plurality did win that seat for Congress. But if we actually go to the next slide here, you'll see a list of the candidates who have already expressed some interest in this seat coming up next year. We have 6 or 7 or more going on here.
Sure.
And
at least 3 or 4 of them ran last time. We've got Eileen Donahue, Jamie Eldridge, and Barry Feingold.
Precisely. And so what we can't know under our first past the post system is whether or not, first of all, will any of them get the majority vote when it comes time to a primary next year? And again, the likelihood of that is pretty close to 0, particularly with that number of really well-qualified candidates. And we certainly want a system that encourages people to run. But you also want to make sure that the person who does win the primary represents the party's strongest chance to win in the general election. And we just don't know that with our first past the post system.
Okay.
So one of the issues we have here, again, is the issue of vote splitting amongst commonly situated candidates. And so going to the next, one more example of the vote splitting circumstance, we can look to the 2013 Boston mayoral primary.
Okay, and Sarah, if you could pull up, there we go.
So if we look at this, there were a lot of candidates running for mayor in Boston 4 years ago. And what was really important about that year is that there are a large number of candidates of color that year. And as a city where it's leaning toward becoming a majority-minority city, the idea of encouraging more people of color to run for mayor is a really important thing. But what happened in the primary election? If you go to the next slide, you'll see that it was, in fact, the 2 white Irish guys who ended up winning the primary election and went on to the general election in November. And what had happened, and if you go to one more slide here, that you'll see that the candidates of color really did split the vote.
They really did, yeah.
You had Charlotte Goler-Ritchie was the largest number at 14%. But there were a lot of other candidates who were absolutely encouraged to run, and we should encourage people to run no matter what their background. But they actually ended up, none of them made it through to the general election because none of them could garner by themselves enough to overcome the only 2 candidates, call it the white Irish candidates in that election.
Sure. And neither one of them even had 20% support.
And neither one of them had 20% support, exactly.
Yeah.
And so whether it's the spoiler issue that we saw in Maine, and there are many, many examples of that throughout our election history, or the vote splitting circumstances where you can see that either in the Democratic primary or the preliminary election in the Boston campaign. These are problems that are out there where we cannot be assured that the best candidate, or the candidate that most represents the interests of the voters, actually gets elected to the seat in question here.
Actually gets selected to run in the general election.
Exactly.
Yeah. So what would this look like then in practice? If we were to do this in practice, what would it look like on the ballot?
So what this is ranked choice voting. So let's bring up the next slide here.
I think it's slide 11.
Yeah. And what
I'm sorry, Sarah. It's slide 11. I don't think. There we go.
Yeah,
Perfect.
Exactly. So in the ballot booth, you might see a ballot much like this, where instead of just picking a single candidate, you actually have the opportunity to select the candidates in the order of your preference. So for instance, if candidate 2 is your favorite candidate, they're the ones who represent your interests spot on, you would mark them off by filling in the number 1 oval for them. But if candidate 1 shares a lot of the same ideas as you do, and you'd say, hey, they'd be a good second choice in case my first choice isn't the first choice of a lot of people as well, you can mark candidate 2 as your candidate 1 as your second choice, and then you could certainly choose candidate 3 as your third choice. though the idea is to rank the order of the candidates in the order of preference with the ultimate goal of making sure that the candidate with majority support amongst the entire electorate is the one who garners the seat at the election time.
Rather than a plurality.
Rather than a plurality.
Okay. And I think we have a video
Exactly.
to show exactly how this would work. So,
Exactly.
Sarah, if you want to pull up that video, please.
In most elections, you only vote for one candidate for each office. But in some elections, voters can rank 3 or more candidates for each office. It's called ranked choice voting. Here's an example of how it works. All of the candidates will be listed on the ballot in 3 columns. Make your first choice vote in column 1 by filling in the oval of the candidate you'd most like to win. Vote for your second choice in column 2 and make your third choice in column 3. That's all there is to it. Now let's see how the votes are counted. Let's say there are 4 candidates running for mayor: Asha, Zach, Omar, and Lucy. Once the polls close, we count all the first choice votes first. To be elected mayor, a candidate needs more than half the votes. In this example, Asha has more than half of the votes, so she's declared the winner. However, if no candidate gets more than half the votes, we start eliminating candidates and counting the next choices of those who voted. In this example, Zach is the candidate with the smallest number of first choice votes, so he is cut. We use the second choice votes on Zach's ballots and count those voters' second choices instead. If one of the remaining candidates now has more than half of the total votes, that candidate is declared the winner. If not, the next lowest candidate, Lucy, is eliminated. Her votes are now counted for the next choice on the ballot. Some of Lucy's votes went to Zach, who was already eliminated, so those new votes for Zach instead count for those voters' third choice candidate. We are now down to 2 candidates, and Omar clearly has more than half of the votes. That makes him the winner. That's how ranked choice voting works. For more information on ranked choice voting, visit our website.
So we'll show you our website for Massachusetts a little later on.
Sure.
But ultimately, the goal is shown in that video is that you're seeking a candidate that has majority support. And there are ways that you make sure that that happens. Again, part of the idea is that to find candidates that match the interests of the majority of the electorate, to give the voters a real chance for their voice to be heard across the board. And so let's for a second talk about how that might have worked in practice. So if we could bring up that the next slide, which I think is 13.
Slide 13 or slide 12? Slide
13, that's it, exactly
Okay.
right. So this is going back to the example in Maine. And we look at what would happen if people had a chance to make their second choice. Well, would the people who had voted for Libby Mitchell, who would they have likely voted for second? Would they have voted for the Republican Paul LePage, or more likely the independent Elliott Cutler? Now, it's speculative in nature, but given what we know about Paul LePage, I think it's unlikely that the Democratic voters for Libby Mitchell would have gone all the way to Paul LePage's end, and more likely would have voted, at least certainly in a significant amount, for Elliott Cutler. And so had ranked choice voting been in play there in Maine in 2010, it is far more likely that Elliott Cutler, who was an independent, perhaps more of a centrist candidate than certainly Paul LePage, would have actually won the governorship up there in Maine. And his views would have been more reflective of the majority of the voters in Maine.
Of the majority of the electorate in that state, yes.
Exactly. And so, again, whatever you might say about Paul LePage, again, we know that he was elected with less than 40% of support. Now, again, if ranked choice voting had been in play and the Libby Mitchell voters had gone for Paul LePage, then so be it.
So be it. He'd be elected governor, yeah.
Exactly. But that's an important feature that ranked choice voting is there really to design to make sure that our representatives really represent our interests. Now, there are other places where this could come into play. Perhaps if you could bring up the next slide here. So let's look at this example. Now, this is a purely hypothetical one. But imagine if Bernie Sanders had been able to run as an independent in the general election. Now, I'm not here to argue about Hillary Clinton versus Bernie Sanders. But the one thing we're pretty clear about is that had Bernie been able to run, that there would have been close to 2 million extra voters who stayed home on election day.
Because Bernie wasn't in the race.
Because Bernie wasn't in the race, who would have come out and voted. And had they been given the opportunity to vote, they might have, in fact, not just voted for Bernie won, but they would have been given a chance to say, well, then I want Hillary Clinton as my second choice, or whomever. But the point is that you would have brought these additional voters to the ballot booth. I mean, we certainly have a system here where third-party candidates, or even third candidates in single-party primaries, are diminished in their impact because people might say, oh, they can't win. I'm not going to go and vote anyway.
I can't vote for that person. I'd be throwing my vote away, is what we hear constantly, right?
Exactly. And this is, ranked choice voting gives them an opportunity, gives them, in fact, an incentive to actually get out and vote, knowing that their voice can be heard, but knowing that their vote will not be spoiling any election or causing a split amongst candidates with similar views.
Okay.
And that's it's a fantastic opportunity for voters to make sure to make sure the voters make sure that their voices are heard on election day. Mm-hmm. Again, we have too many people, there's too much cynicism, I think, in politics right now where people don't think their voice can be heard. And ranked choice voting is a very simple and straightforward way to make sure that people can articulate what they want on election day.
Okay, so it's my understanding then that we have some bills in the State House right now about this. Right.
So there are a couple bills in play right now. One is what's known as a local option bill, which would, if passed by the legislature, would allow any city or town to make use of ranked choice voting for their municipal elections. Okay. So right now, it would require some sort of home rule petition or an update to the charter. Amherst out in the western part of the state right now is redoing their charter, and they are entertaining the idea of building ranked choice voting into their charter.
And I think we have a slide about this. Sarah, if you could pull up slide 16. Thank you.
Right. So so there's a local option bill here that deals with that local aspect. And then there's also a statewide bill put forth by Representative Jay Kaufman of Lexington that would, if enacted, would make ranked choice, put it in play for all statewide types offices, certainly governor, the constitutional offices, as well as the state senate, state representative, members of Congress, U.S. senator. And so these are bills that are currently being considered by the Massachusetts legislature that would enact ranked choice voting. We're certainly hoping that they'll get passed. There have been proponents of ranked choice voting who've introduced these bills over many years, and we're hoping that through our efforts that we will encourage more legislators to jump on the bandwagon as it were and see the benefits to ranked choice voting. I want to actually swing back to one particular benefit that comes up in ranked choice voting elections, and that it is a way to bring greater civility to the election process, because candidates have a real incentive, first of all, to campaign positively, but also to not go out there and try to trash their opponents, because they want to go out, they should have an incentive to go out, and even if a voter says, hey, I like Fred over there, we'll say, but our views are the same, at least make me your second choice.
Sure.
I mean, there's a real incentive to talk positively, even to collaborate with other candidates. I mean, yes, they're all trying to be elected to a single seat in our circumstance here, but it really, there's a real incentive to highlight what you are for, as opposed to in a duopolistic system where I can gain by simply knocking you down.
Right.
In a ranked choice voting system, you hurt yourself by going negative, because you won't be the second choice on people's ballots.
Sure.
And that's, I mean, who here would not like to see a more positive,
a more positive and a more civil and more inclusive electoral system? Yeah.
Exactly. And so it's a really nice byproduct. The mayor of Minneapolis, we talked about had the video on the Minneapolis ranked choice voting system. The mayor of Minneapolis really talked about how there was less elbowing amongst the candidates and less negative campaigning because of that, the goal of becoming the second choice. Obviously, you'd be out there campaigning to try to be the first choice of the voters, but being the second choice isn't a bad thing either.
Right,
and
right.
particularly when there are a lot of candidates in a race, those second choice votes will really have an impact.
Sure. Is there any movement on this at the national level, at the federal level?
There was recently a bill put forth by members of Congress and supported by Fair Vote that would set up a system where more than one, I think it's called the Fair Representation Act, that would, instead of having single-seat congressional districts, you actually have multi-seat congressional districts. So rather than having 9 single seats in Massachusetts, you might have 3 districts that would elect 3 members of Congress in each. And presumably that would use a ranked choice type system to make sure that the 3 most popular candidates, you wouldn't have 3 different races.
Okay.
You'd essentially have a single race where the top 3 vote getters would be elected to Congress from that district. And one of the benefits of that is that rather than worrying about gerrymandering, which is a whole separate issue here,
Yes.
but
yeah.
rather than having to worry about gerrymandering, that you can make sure that the voices of even not only the majority of the particular region, but concerted groups. So whether it might be, a Republican might get elected, or maybe you might get a couple extra people of color elected from like an urban area like Boston.
Sure.
So, but in order to have that done properly, you would really need to have a ranked choice system, sort of similar to what's currently used in Cambridge to elect their city council.
City council, yeah.
Exactly. It's the way that's done is a cousin to ranked choice voting. It's a little bit complicated, but the idea is the same. The idea is you want to find the people who have the support of, again, whether it's a majority in the case of a single seat district or the proper proportion of support for a multi-seat circumstance.
Okay, that's interesting that you would say, like, you would see something like in Massachusetts where we have 9 congressional districts that would actually be down to 3 congressional districts, each putting 3 representatives in.
Yeah, exactly. So that's where you're seeing at the national level. Now, as we know that all elections, we start off the program about everything is local. All elections are done at the statewide level. Even we talk about presidential elections. It's a statewide election to vote electors.
Right.
And so the push nationally it would really have to be sort of on the concept level, that we are working to improve the election processes. I know that Fair Vote does great work. They are a supporter of Voter Choice Massachusetts. We are working with them very closely. And so we look to Fair Vote to help to get that support and to get more interest in this concept nationwide. But it really comes down to the state organizations such as Voter Choice Massachusetts to push it like here in Massachusetts.
Okay, so it's interesting. What about constitutionality? Would there be any constitutional question were we to go to a system like that at the federal level?
Not at the federal level. Again, mostly because elections are run by the state. So there's
Right.
there's no issue at the federal level. At the Massachusetts level, there's a very interesting provision in the Massachusetts Constitution that applies to the constitutional offices that requires people to be elected with the highest number of votes. But that's an undefined term in the Massachusetts Constitution. And it has not been litigated, it has not been determined to mean plurality or anything else. And so our feeling is that ranked choice voting is simply a method to determine
the highest
who has
number
the
of
highest
votes.
number of votes. It's
Sure.
just not necessarily on the first choice and such. But there's nothing that I'm aware of, and I've certainly looked at the Massachusetts Constitution, that would prevent it from being in play. And again, all you have to do is point to Cambridge and say, it's been used in Cambridge for 70 years at this point in
for
some
X
form.
number of years, yeah.
Exactly. And so the concept is certainly not foreign and not by itself problematic. We just need to make sure that when it gets enacted here in Massachusetts, that it's done in the right way.
That it's done right.
Exactly.
Yep. Awesome, awesome. So we have a couple of minutes left. How would my viewers learn more if they
Right,
wanted
so
to learn more about your program
Right.
here?
So again, Voter Choice Massachusetts is looking for more volunteers and more people interested in electoral reform to help us spread the word.
Okay, and Sarah, could we bring up our final slide? I believe it's number 17.
Right.
Or?
So one of the things that we have to do is get more people educated about ranked choice voting, and that requires me to go on programs like this or to talk to various groups around the state. I was in Uxbridge a couple weeks ago talking, and I've been in Newton, I've been in Natick, and I'll be
I ran into your guys in Uxbridge yesterday at the GBV Dems picnic that
exactly.
we had there.
So I would encourage people to go to our website, which is voterchoicema.org, and sign up. get on our mailing list and find out when events are happening in your area, certainly down here in the Blackstone Valley, to learn more about ranked choice voting, because we want people to learn about this, to ask good questions, and get comfortable with the idea, so that whether it's enacted through the legislature, as we talked about, or if we eventually go through a ballot question, that people know about this and understand how it will improve our electoral process. And so please, please go to our website, sign up. If you're really interested, we'd love to have you as a volunteer. And if you're really, really interested, as treasurer of the organization, we'd love to get your donation, because it will help us reach out to, again, even more people, and allow us to really bring this reform and make it real here in Massachusetts.
All right.
You can catch us on Facebook. You can follow us on Twitter. Please do so.
All right, terrific. Jim, thank you so much for being here. Thanks for your dedication to this cause. It's inspiring to see.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity to share it with you, John, and the rest of the folks here in Milford.
All right, terrific. Thanks again for being on.
My
really
pleasure.
appreciate you coming here.
Great, thank
All right.
you.
And you've been watching All Politics is Local. All Politics is Local is a production of the Greater Blackstone Valley Democrats. For more information about the Greater Blackstone Valley Dems, feel free to visit our website at www.gbvdems.org. Thanks for tuning in, everybody, and good night. And we're